the previous talk, I think, was excellent, excellent overview of what an individual municipality can do in terms of preparing and adapting to the challenges of sea level rise and flooding. And we have in our region a number of localities that are beginning similar sorts of processes as what Fort Lauderdale has done. I don't know if any of them have gone quite as far as Fort Lauderdale, although the price ticket is going to be the same for many other localities throughout the country that are located in vulnerable areas. Today I'm going to focus on what we at the HRPDC are doing from a regional perspective to enable our local governments to better plan for sea level rise. I can provide answers about some of what our local governments are doing, but if you want some answers about specific actions that are being done on the ground, feel free to ask. But I'm going to just talk about for now about what the sort of technical assistance efforts that we provide our local governments. So just overview of what I would like to talk about today. First, to give you an introduction to when we call it Hampton Roads, what we mean by that. Anybody from Virginia in the room? Nobody? Mid-Atlantic, anybody? Mid-Atlantic? 2, 3, okay, getting close. And then talk about some examples of the technical assistance that we provide to local governments. So I promised you a map, and here it is. So when we say Hampton Roads, this is what we mean. It is the name that our communities in southeastern Virginia have adopted as their own, as a region. So if you've heard of Virginia Beach or Williamsburg or Norfolk, all those localities are located in what we call Hampton Roads. And funny enough, the name Hampton Roads actually comes from a body of water, and I don't think I have a pointer here, but if you look between Norfolk and Hampton, that body of water is actually called Hampton Roads. And it comes from a word, roadstead, which is it's a sheltered anchorage like a harbor, but not quite as good. And so that's, we were trying to think of a name to put on our regional postmark to separate ourselves from Richmond and other areas in Virginia, and that's the name that stuck. Of course, the postmark is gone now, but still the name is still there. And so as a region, this is our planning district boundary here. We are a state-enabled but locally created regional planning organization that provides a forum for all the elected officials from our 17 member jurisdictions. I actually left one of the towns off the map here, haven't updated it yet, to come together and discuss and deliberate about issues of greater than local concern. And sea level rise and recurrent flooding, as we call it in Virginia, is clearly one of those issues of greater than local concern. As we like to say, water does not respect jurisdictional boundaries, no matter how hard you try. So why is that important to us, and why is Hampton Roads as a region important? I think you may have seen this map in other places, but in a nutshell, what it shows here are all the Department of Defense facilities that are located in our region, some of the other federal facilities as well. You may be aware that we are home to the largest naval base in the world, Naval Station Norfolk, as well as many other Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, Army facilities throughout the region. The Virginia Beach oceanfront is also one of the major tourist draws on the East Coast. In addition, we have the only port on the East Coast that is currently cleared to go to 55 feet of draft for its channel, navigable channel. Right now we're at 50 feet there, but that is one of the major ports on the East Coast. So clearly, a lot of waterfront infrastructure, a lot of waterfront industry, things that relate to the water. You can't really do these things without being right on the water, and so dealing with sea level rise is one of the things that we are focusing quite a bit on at both the regional and the local level. So really, from our perspective, we have two problems, and I think Nancy hit on quite a bit of this already, but we have what we call euphemistically in Virginia recurrent flooding, since we can't say sea level rise in certain areas, and then we have sea level rise. And recurrent flooding is that nuisance flooding that Nancy mentioned before. I noticed that actually all three of our communities are on that list of cities that were vulnerable to tidal flooding and expected to have greater and greater rates of tidal flooding over the next 50 years. So that's an operational challenge. What do you do when you can't get your school buses through to the neighborhoods? What do you do when your stormwater system is insufficient now? From looking at sea level rise, it's a planning challenge. What do you do when you're wrestling with this challenge today and trying to spend money on infrastructure right now, at the same time knowing that there are areas that unless you put up a big wall and install large pumps to keep the water out, that those areas may become uninhabitable 50, 75, 100 years from now? How do you transition from point A now to point B, 2100 or so, or any other time in the future where the impacts become too great? Just some graphic examples, because everyone likes likes pictures of flooding. So just an area of Norfolk here during a storm event. Another area here, I used to live down the street. I picked where I lived because that was on the high ridge, the original road going through the neighborhood there. Everything else is generally built on fill or close to it here. An area in Hampton, so going across the water to look at, I believe this was after one of the tropical storm or hurricane in the mid-2000s. And then an example of one of those blue sky flooding, I think that was the term Nancy used here. The church here doesn't particularly enjoy being the poster child for sea level rise in Norfolk, but I want to say they might have sold it, but they're still working on it. And this is from the perspective of one of our major cultural institutions, the Chrysler Museum of Art. So if you were standing where this front row is here, that would be where the end of what we call the Hague is, a body of water there. And this floods regularly here as part of one of our most historic neighborhoods in Norfolk. Experiences quite a bit of flooding. So when we talk about in Hampton Roads dealing with sea level rise, we have two issues. One is this global sea level rise that is occurring as a result of global warming. Heat, so the oceans warm up, the water expands, ice melts, adds to the total amount of water in those oceans. That's part of the problem. But in Hampton Roads, in addition to other areas around the mid-Atlantic, you may have heard of the so-called hotspot for sea level rise. We're also subsiding. We are sinking as a region, not just in areas that are built on fill, but region-wide. And the two major causes of that are groundwater withdrawals. So we take a lot of water out of the ground, and that causes our region to subside, both industrially and also for residential or other commercial uses. And also this phenomenon called glacial isostasy. So if you think of glaciers, they're big blocks of ice. They're really heavy. And back in the last ice age, there was a big giant glacier over the northern United States pushing down on the land there. And as that glacier receded, it melted. The area that was previously being pushed down by that ice started to raise up again. Well, Hampton Roads wasn't under the ice, but we were being kind of pushed up like a seesaw, like a teeter-totter. And now we're slowly shifting back down. And that's probably about, roughly a quarter of the subsidence. I'll get into this later, but we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on in terms of subsidence, in terms of actual numbers. But the groundwater withdrawals are the major cause of subsidence in our region. And then one of the newer things that we're discovering is that another result or impact of the warming of the oceans is that they're changing the rate and the direction of some of the ocean currents that are out there. So you may have heard of the Gulf Stream. It's part of a larger current that goes throughout the entire Atlantic Ocean, and as that slows down because of the warming of the oceans, water that was previously being kept offshore in kind of a bulge, and it's fascinating to read about this stuff, is now sloshing up against the mid-Atlantic of this country, all the way from, I want to say, South Carolina all the way up to about Boston, up to here. So this kind of triple whammy now of sea level rise, of localized impacts that are increasing the impact of sea level rise on our region. So, one of the things we do, the services that we provide our local governments, is to give them good data on sea level rise. And this is just the historic rate. This is based on the Sewell's Point tide gauge. It's right there at the naval base in Norfolk. It's been there for about 85 years now, and the trend is pretty clear that even if you disregard that last bit, which shows a little bit of acceleration there at the end in the last 10 years, that we are already experiencing relative sea level rise of about 1.5 feet per year. When you add in global projections from, these are the ones, and this is one of the problems.
1.5 feet.
1.5
inches?
1.5 feet, per century, I apologize, yes. So actually it's like 4 millimeters. I took a red eye from California last night, so we'll just blame that on the red eye. Thank you, Nancy. So these are the global sea level rise scenarios from the latest National Climate Assessment. They don't account for any of those localized effects I just mentioned to you. But when you add in the historic sea level rise and those effects that I mentioned before, which basically add up into our local subsidence influence, you get something like this, and I apologize for the garishness of the colors, but still, this is the kind of tool that we can give our local governments to say, these are the kind of scenarios, the projections that you should be planning for. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is for our local governments to be able to use that tidal record to actually say that this is something that's been documented. It's not just in a report. It's not just a projection from the IPCC. Virginia is somewhat a conservative state. don't really like things that are coming from international bodies too often. And certainly sea level rise is a major issue politically. But having that title record has been a great assistance to us. So at the Planning District Commission, one of the things that we do in addition to providing the sort of just raw data is we turn out mapping products that our localities can use both at a regional level but also for their own local planning efforts. And so if you just imagine these 4 curves here at the end, and the colors aren't going to be the same, but this is what it looks like when you map those on our region. And you can see a few of our jurisdictions are significantly going to be impacted by sea level rise. So Norfolk, Virginia Beach, all this blue up here is currently wetlands and marshes. It's all going to be underwater by the end of the century, even with the historic rate of sea level rise. With the accelerated rates, and we're looking actually, and again, the likely scenario that Nancy mentioned earlier, between the low and the intermediate scenario, so we're expecting somewhere between 2.5 and 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. That everything but the yellow, that's the highest scenario, don't worry about that too much. But the other 2 scenarios, the green, the lighter blue, those areas are probably going to be underwater or frequently flooded as a result of storm flooding or just higher than average high tides. And so we'll put out products like this to our communities, and then they're able to use it to really drill down to their to the local level and see what those impacts might be. Not only from an illustrative standpoint like this, putting it on a map, but also to look at what infrastructure is there, what houses are there, how much is the property worth in an area like this that might be vulnerable. Now that was Norfolk before. This is you can see this is actually the Old Town Portsmouth right here. So 2 of the oldest communities in Virginia, oldest English-speaking communities in the country. Just another example here of the kind of analysis that we'll produce. This is actually based on storm surge. And then again here, where we can take sea level rise inundation zones, and we've been doing this for a number of years, so that's why the maps keep changing. But turn them into information that decision makers can use to really start to prioritize how much they should be doing about sea level rise and whether it should be something that they put at the top of their list, in the middle of their list, or at the bottom of their list. And I don't think I have to point this out directly, but I'll be honest, sea level rise is not necessarily the priority for a lot of decision makers out there. They have things called schools that they have to pay for on a yearly basis. Now, when they get a call about flooding, they generally do tend to respond pretty quickly to that. But if it's not flooding, if there's not a storm coming in, it's very easy to start to forget about something like sea level rise or flooding unless it's on the news or you have your constituents calling you all the time. So that's just some examples of the sort of the projections and the mapping analysis that we've done. We've recently started working with our sister agency, the MPO for Hampton Roads. It's the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization, and they've been working on trying to identify which roadways that are important regionally, so not the local roads, but the regionally important roads that are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge, and starting to figure out how to incorporate that into their long-term planning and programming planning documents. So this just example here, I've already emphasized how important the military is to our region. They did a survey to actually, with the military dependents, also active duty and civilian employees, to identify roadways that were being used by the military community in Hampton Roads to figure out how they can prioritize and use that information for their long-term planning processes. So they're starting to use this information, like I said. Our mapping products are now being used for their long-range transportation plan, and that should be, I think, coming out in the next one in a few years. I think that's going to be part of that document. So one of the other things that we've been doing at the Planning District Commission is trying to help our localities start to really think about this from a conceptual standpoint. What does sea level rise mean for them? What are the types of broad options they can do to start, fixing their current issues, but also thinking ahead to the future? This past June, and I thank you for mentioning the Dutch earlier in your question, we actually hosted with the City of Norfolk and the City of Hampton, a workshop with the Dutch Embassy. With they brought over Dutch experts from government and also private companies. We brought in some American experts from outside our region for 5 days to sit down and wrestle with sea level rise and flooding in Hampton Roads and identify some solutions, conceptualize the issue, but then identify solutions that aren't just fixing the flooding, but also are improving our communities. And just some of the diagrams that were put together about this. This one just shows the areas that are going to be vulnerable overlaid with some of the infrastructure that's important to the region. I like this one a lot because if you go back and you look at some of the other work that was done, you know, where you are in terms of elevation is going to dictate what sort of strategies will be useful in working and addressing flooding. So if you're up high enough, you can infiltrate that water if your soils allow for it. But if you're in that kind of middle zone, you're going to have to start thinking about storing that water and then letting it drain after an event. And if you're in the low-lying areas, which is a lot of our older cities are, you know, you're going to have to store that water, you know, when it hits, and then you're going to have to pump it out later probably. You know, we talked also about storm surge barriers and whether or not they will work. They probably won't work. That's just that in a nutshell. Started to look at, from a regional standpoint, what sort of edge conditions do we have and what sort of strategies can we use to apply across our region. Things like we have beaches, we have commercially developed residential shorelines with housing communities on them, we have industrial shorelines, we have wetlands, and the strategies that we use for all of those are going to change depending on what those edge conditions are like. And then the last thing I want to talk about is, and this is just an example of what we're doing, is identifying data gaps and then going out there and working with other partners to correct those data gaps, to identify solutions and monitoring programs so that we can bring that information back to our locality so they can actually use that information and act on it. And this, right now, you know, I mentioned subsidence earlier, is that, you know, I'll be frank, we don't really actually have a good grasp of how much subsidence is happening and why it is happening. And both of those questions are going to have a huge impact on what we can do about it. And so, for example, if it is groundwater that is causing it and we know how much that's happening, then maybe we'll change our groundwater management policies in Virginia to reduce that, and that'll buy us some time in adapting to sea level rise. So that's actually the last slide I had. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.